There's a ton of weird advice out there for music producers. Stuff that you hear in top 5 mix tips or top 10 music industry myths videos. Things that may not necessarily be lies, but they might not be so true either. So I want to talk about a few things you may have heard from other sources, as well as a few things that nobody else is going to tell you, because there is nothing worse than being fed bad information by someone who doesn't know any better. And if you're new here, my name is Adam, and every week I drop a new video about music production. So subscribe if that's something that you're into. And I also want to give a shout out to Jesse Cinco for inspiring this video. Jesse made an awesome video about filmmaking advice that you should check out next if you're into making videos too, which I'll link in the description. So big ups to Jesse for this awesome topic that I really wanted to flip into the music production world. So first up, it's fairly common to see music production videos sponsored by a certain gear company or plugin, and they tell you that this piece of gear or this software is going to change the game. One thing that it seems like nobody talks about is just how important your actual computer is. If you gave me the choice between the nicest studio in the world with amazing acoustic treatment and a $1 zillion mic locker, but it's got a computer that constantly crashes unless I'm freezing tracks, or a top of the line computer with a pair of good headphones and that's it, I might just pick the nice computer. Now, why is it that no one's talking about computers? Well, for one, music production companies aren't making computers. It's basically Apple and then PC, and that's it. And they're not sponsoring us. And you can make some affiliate money if you tell people to buy a computer, but most people buy a computer every couple of years max. So you're not going to be getting people to like impulse buy a computer. And so it doesn't make the cut in a lot of these lists. You know, I'm not going to make a video that says top 5 gear you should buy to change the game. And number 1 is a new computer, because you're not going to buy it. Mac's not going to pay me to talk about it. So the video doesn't get made. But getting a serious computer, that will unlock so many more options for you than you might realize. So when your CPU is actually OP, things like battling latency or avoiding using the good plugin because it hogs resources, that becomes a thing of the past. It's so nice to have a session with 35 really great software instruments running and none of them are rendered in place. So if you're saving up for more recording gear, but your computer keeps crashing, maybe make it a goal to get something new with a little more juice before you upgrade any of your recording gear. Now, another thing that you may want to keep in mind on places like this is that the stories and advice you hear in this production influencer world don't always apply to every situation. Here's an example. In a video a few months ago, Rick Beato said something about how producers will have another drummer come into the studio if the band's drummer isn't playing well enough, or that it's pretty common for bands to have a session drummer come secretly in and nail the parts. And that's not necessarily false. In fact, it happens in some parts of the industry fairly often. However, I saw a post from a poor fella who was wondering if his local band's producer was going to hire a drummer to come replay their parts, because if so, he would be against that. And he wanted to know what he could say to make sure that that doesn't happen, because he was the one paying for his portion of the recording. So when people asked why he thought that, he said he saw Rick's video and it spooked him. Now, I'm not saying that either Rick or this drummer were in the wrong for saying or thinking what they did. And frankly, I didn't even see the video that they were talking about. But I can imagine that Rick was talking about specific instances where high-profile clients needed to bring in a ringer for a serious record with a big budget, not some local producer who's like working with small bands making their first ever recordings. So with all that said, if one person says something kind of offhand about how the music industry works, I'm not saying that's what Rick did or didn't do, but just don't take it as gospel that applies to every single scenario. because it might be a side point to the main thing they're actually talking about, and it may not apply to your situation at all. Now, one other thing that's important to consider is what I'm going to call the plastic surgery rule, but it needs a better name. So if you could think of one, go ahead and comment because I need suggestions. But if you saw 1,000 people walking down the street and 100 of them had plastic surgery done last week, but 10 of them were really blatant and obvious, you would probably say, dog, I saw those 10 people that got plastic surgery and it just looks super fake. Everyone can tell. Nobody should be getting that done. The other 990 people have the right idea. Well, for one, if the 10 people with the obvious surgery want to look that way, what does it matter to you? But two, those other 90 people who got the subtle work done totally break the game. If someone says they hate when records use drum samples or amp sims because they can always tell and it sounds bad, well, if you could tell and it sounds bad, then they're part of the percentage that didn't get away with it. Now, the other folks who did it tastefully snuck under the radar, and there are definitely people listening to albums full of fake drums and amps telling their buddies how good it sounds, since the band probably went through the trouble to finally record real drums and amps. And while I love recording real amps and drums, it's also important to remember that not everyone is going for the sound you're going for. If a modern rock band wants that totally slammed, modern, and massive drum tone, and they went for it, it probably sounds great to 99% of the general public who couldn't tell you what a ride cymbal is. And if they were going for a Led Zeppelin kind of drum sound and they failed, then you might have a point. But don't forget that they might just actually like the sound that they achieved. So when someone says, oh, you can always tell that it's fake drums and fake amps and it always sounds bad, so you shouldn't do that, just keep in mind, plastic surgery rule. Now, in the same vein, just because someone says that you have to do something a certain way, that doesn't really make it true. I've had mastering engineers tell me they hate when they get mixes with processing on the mix bus. I've heard others say they literally don't care at all. I've worked with mixers who wanted totally dry DI guitars so they could put their own Kemper profiles on them. And I've also worked with some who would probably laugh if you even suggested they should be doing that. So when you're working with other people in the real world, the best thing you can do is just ask what they want. And if you like doing something a certain way, there's no need to stop doing it because someone on the internet said you shouldn't do it that way. I can't tell you the amount of times I've been working with someone who did something a certain way, and when I asked why, like, let's just say, I don't know, made up example, they have all their compressors set 3-to-1 for vocals. And I ask if they could set it to more like 4-to-1, and they say, oh, I wouldn't do that. And the reason is because some engineer that they watch said they never go above 3-to-1 on vocals. But you have to consider, in the engineer's video, they were probably vocals they recorded the way they always do it, and they know that for the style of mix that they're going for, 3-to-1 is the sweet spot. Well, if you recorded a totally different vocal in a different studio, different gear, different song, different singer, you get the idea. And speaking of different gear, one talking point that I really think we can put to bed is the idea that gear doesn't matter. Like, we all know in our heart of hearts, it does matter. And I think when people say that it doesn't, they're just trying to push people to focus on things they can improve without spending a bunch of money, like learning. A monkey on a unicycle isn't going to become a great producer if you give it the best gear in the world, but realistically, we can focus on more than one thing at a time, like learning and improving our gear. Factually speaking, there is a limit to how much one can do with any one piece of gear before they've skilled their way into growing out of it. Like, on one hand, Eric Valentine and CLA could make a great sounding record with all SM57s mixing on a boombox, but they've also got decades of experience and know how to overcome those obstacles. And also, I'm tapped out on hearing gear doesn't mean anything if the song isn't great. Like, yeah, I know, but Does anyone think we're over here trying to make non-great songs on purpose? Of course, you need a great song to make a hit record, but a great song also isn't going to go anywhere if it's recorded badly and mixed terribly. Again, we can focus on two things at once. We can try to make a fabulous sounding recording of a great song. Fabulous recording, great song. Do both. Like if an artist I worked with said they didn't like the headphones that I gave them to track their vocals or the way that the mic made their voice sound, and I said to them, good gear doesn't mean anything unless you have a great song, they would probably be on the news that night for assault. Oh, and by the way, I have an update on the book I've been working on. I finally have the actual cover. In case you missed it, I've been working on making a planner for music producers specifically, since all of the generic planners suck to use for producing. And I got samples made with a really basic cover, but I got the actual design in and I want your opinions. So this is the first color scheme and I was going to use it, but I wanted to see it in a different color. So there's also this one. So let me know if you have a favorite because I'm honestly kind of torn. And also, if you don't want to wait for the actual book to come out, you can print the to-do list section out yourself. Just click the link in the description and I'll email you the template for free. And you can print out as many copies as you want and use it every day. So update out of the way, very cool. So we know gear matters to a point, but it's really important to consider where or who you're getting your gear advice from. On one end of the spectrum, there are folks who have no clue what they're doing or listening for when demoing gear. For some reason, I feel like I've seen countless people say they prefer the Rode NT1A to like a Neumann U87, including more than one people who commented that on my U87 video. And it's like, sure, but anytime I see someone say that in a social media post, like on Facebook, I'll click on their page and it doesn't look like they work in a studio or even record often. And they're usually saying something like, I tried the U87 at the store and I didn't like it as much as the mic I already have at home. Or they're saying, I tried that mic at a studio that had it and I prefer the NT1A when I got back. So of course, you preferred your mic at your home studio over the one at the store, because how are you demoing a nice condenser mic at the store? And is doing it at a studio and not your house not a bad A/B test? Like I demoed the $10,000 Sony mic at NAMM and it sounded awful because I was in a convention center full of people and I was using $100 headphones. Does that mean the SM7B I have at home is better? Probably not. There's also some gear that works in a home setting, like if you're recording basic demos, but when it has to stand up to serious studio use, it kind of falls apart. For example, if you had a mic that had a brittle or harsh high end, if you record one vocal and mix it in with an instrumental, that probably works. But if you have to use that one mic for 100 tracks of instruments and vocals in a nice room, and then you're trying to mix all of that, like mixing it together, you're gonna have to make a serious effort to make it sound good. So while I don't think you should just take advice from any random person on the internet with 3 songs recorded, on the other end of the spectrum, there are some people who do this stuff who are on YouTube who can make anything sound passable with enough work. This is kind of a random example, but I watched Fluff's video about buying the cheapest guitar on Amazon, and it sounded pretty cool in his video. And I happened to have a gift card for Amazon for the same amount as the guitar costs. Now, out of the box, that guitar sounded absolutely terrible. But Fluff is someone who makes a living dialing in guitar tones and demoing them. So obviously he knew how to handle the problem. And so would I. Like I can make that guitar work, but I would never give it to a beginner who wants to learn guitar because they don't have the tools to actually make it sing. And, you know, Fluff talks about that in the video, but if you watch the video, you just watched a high quality demo of this guitar through really nice amps and he's playing awesome riffs and the demo song is mixed really well and it sounds great, there are going to be people who buy it anyway. And then they don't have the tools to make it sound good. One other fun example is a buddy of mine who mixed a song where one singer recorded their parts on a C800 clone and the other used an SM7B. Now, obviously, they sounded different. I'm not going to say one sounded better, but the C800 clone sounded better. Now, he told me he spent a serious chunk of his day trying to get the SM7B vocal to sound good enough to stand up to the C800. And the final mix and master turned out great, but I immediately cringed imagining the guy with the SM7B telling other people that nice mics are a waste of money since he collaborated with someone whose mic was 4 times as expensive and the vocals came out the exact same. So just keep that in mind when someone tells you that they recorded their hit record in their walk-in closet on a microwave microphone. Like, you don't know how much work went in behind the scenes to rescue that probably mid recording. And sometimes the artist doesn't either. Now, one other thing I hear all the time from other producers and engineers is that you shouldn't over quantize things or tune them too much because you'll suck the life out of them, and that instead you should do more takes until they get it right. Now, in a perfect world, I don't disagree with that at all. If I was recording a super band of all my favorite musicians, I'd do the same thing. But if you're working with people who have less than perfect groove or they don't get every note totally right, don't discard the tools at your disposal to make it better. Like, I wouldn't quantize Bernard Purdie's drums, but Jimmy from Quiznos probably doesn't have as much groove. And if the genre that you're working on requires gridded drums to fit in, just do it. And for the love of all that is holy, do not sit there and make singers do 1,000 takes of vocals until they can't sing anymore because you've decided that tuning is out of style. And you heard somebody say in a podcast that you got to do a zillion takes and push them and nail it and whatever else. Honestly, get a feel for what a great vocal sounds like without tuning, but something that Melodyne or Auto-Tune could conceivably fix while still sounding natural, and shoot for that if that's what it takes. Because 95% of singers will hate you for making them go through their parts over and over and over again to hit some standard that they just A, don't care about, and B, aren't going to reach in one session. Like, I think a lot of music production folks who have been to the very top of the mountain forget what it's like to work with people who aren't pros, or how it feels to get stems in your inbox that just sound straight up bad, or to work with people who maybe don't have the best pitch. And they also forget what it's like to work on records that don't have a $25,000 budget. So just do what you need to do to make a good sounding or great sounding recording that you and the artist are happy with. And don't worry about living up to some artificial standard of processes of the people that aren't signing your checks or realistically going to hear those records anyway. And last but not least, the number one thing that you should stop listening to production influencers about is that you should burn the candle at both ends, grinding it out and just forget about everything else and just struggle and, whatever, make it happen. Health be damned. So if that's something that you are struggling with, then you should go ahead and watch